Let's begin here, because too many confuse silence with rejection. A man who grows quiet after intimacy is not always turning away. His body withdraws, yes, but his soul may simply be returning to center. A woman often feels this shift like a door closing. The warmth that filled the room a moment ago suddenly fades and doubt rushes in. Was it only desire? Was the connection real? These questions strike hardest when the silence is deepest. But Jung reminds us that what seems like absence may be a necessary rhythm of the psyche. The masculine retreats not to abandon, but to restore balance. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Too often we believe that love is confirmed only in words, in gestures, in constant reassurance. Yet the unconscious has its own cycles, its own laws that run beneath what we see. After intimacy, the feminine usually longs to remain in closeness, to keep the bond alive with touch and conversation. The masculine, by contrast, slips into quiet. This contrast does not signal failure. It reveals the polarity that makes union possible. When the silence arrives, many women interpret it as personal rejection. The persona, that outward mask we wear, begins to fracture. Beneath it rises the shadow voice, "You are not enough." He no longer desires you. He is already leaving. And yet these fears are not the truth of the moment. They are projections from the wounded self, echoes of old abandonments and unmet needs. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The silence after passion is one such unconscious moment. Here, the challenge begins. Do we let the shadow speak for us, filling the space with fear? Or do we hold steady, trusting that this pause belongs to the natural rhythm of connection? The setup for our journey is simple but profound. What feels like an ending is often a threshold. Silence is not emptiness. It can be the ground from which deeper devotion grows if we learn how to stand in it. This is the doorway we now open. Not to chase, not to demand, but to see differently. For when we understand what truly happens in those fragile minutes, we discover a truth that changes everything. In the beginning, closeness feels simple. Two people meet in desire, in warmth, in the promise of belonging. Every gesture whispers connection. Every glance carries hope. It is easy to believe the bond is sealed permanent beyond doubt. But then the fracture arrives. It is rarely loud. More often, it is quiet, so quiet that it pierces deeper than words. One turns away. The room grows still, and the other is left staring into an invisible wall. What had been fire becomes silence. What had been tenderness becomes distance. This is the moment when the shadow begins its whisper. It does not speak of biology or natural cycles. It speaks in accusation. You are not enough. You are only desired for a moment. You have already been replaced. These are not facts, but echoes of earlier wounds, places in the soul that still ache from abandonment or rejection. The silence simply awakens them. Jung often described how the unconscious reveals itself through what we misunderstand. In these minutes after passion, the unconscious speaks not through logic, but through projection. A woman may feel his withdrawal, as proof of her inadequacy. A man may experience her longing as pressure or demand. Neither perception is the whole truth, yet both feel unshakably real. Here is the first fracture, not the silence itself, but what the silence awakens. The persona, the outward mask of confidence, cannot hold steady in that void. Beneath it, the vulnerable self trembles. The questions come in waves. Did he truly want me? Is this already the end? It is here that love feels most fragile, not because it has disappeared, but because the shadow has stepped forward to take its place. We often believe that love should be constant reassurance, unbroken affirmation, a steady flow of words that confirm our worth. Yet human connection is never so simple. It moves in cycles like breath. Inhale, exhale, expansion, retreat. To expect only closeness is to deny half of the rhythm. And when we resist the rhythm, we suffer. The first fracture is painful because it confronts us with emptiness. It feels unnatural, almost cruel. But in truth, it mirrors a deeper law. Every act of union stirs the fear of separation. Every opening of the heart awakens the memory of times we were not met, not held, not chosen. The silence after intimacy becomes a screen upon which these old shadows are projected. Think of it as a mirror suddenly placed before the soul. In the glow of passion, we see beauty and connection. In the stillness that follows, we see doubt and fear. Both images are reflections, but only one is trusted. The fracture occurs when we believe the darker reflection is the truth of who we are. This is why so many women standing in that silence feel compelled to speak, to ask to fill the void with urgent words. Do you still love me? Did you feel the same? Are you drifting away? The impulse comes not from love, but from fear. And fear, when expressed in that delicate moment, often drives the other further into retreat. Here we encounter the paradox. What seems like the path to reassurance, seeking words, seeking proof, often secures the opposite. The more the silence is pressed, the tighter it closes. The man instinctively seeking his balance feels trapped. The woman longing for closeness feels abandoned. Both are caught in a cycle where no one wins. Jung observed that our relationships are shaped by the parts of ourselves we do not yet recognize. The fear of abandonment, the hunger for constant affirmation, the inability to rest in our own worth, these are not created by the partner's silence. They already live within us. The silence only brings them into the light. The first fracture, then, is not a betrayal by the other. It is a confrontation with ourselves. It is the moment when the shadow rises and demands to be seen. And if we cannot face it, we project it outward, blaming the partner for wounds that belong to our own soul. This is why the early moments after passion feel so confusing. The body is still warm, yet the heart grows cold. The persona wants to believe in connection, yet the shadow insists on rejection. The fracture is the gap between these two voices, and in that gap, every insecurity we thought we had mastered comes rushing back. What feels unbearable in this moment is not the partner's silence. It is the confrontation with our own inner silence, the space where worth is uncertain, where love feels conditional, where we fear we do not belong. This is the ground where many relationships falter, not because the bond is broken, but because neither partner knows how to hold the silence without collapsing into fear. When we understand this, the first fracture takes on new meaning. It is not simply a wound inflicted by another. It is a revelation of what has been sleeping inside us all along. The silence is the stage upon which our shadow performs. It is painful, yes, but also necessary. For without the fracture, we would never see the fault lines that run through our own foundation. After the first fracture, when silence has awakened fear, the deeper conflict begins. It is no longer simply about what he does or does not say. It becomes a struggle within the self, between the mask worn outwardly and the tremor felt inside. The persona, that carefully crafted surface of confidence, tries to remain calm. She tells herself nothing is wrong, that she should not appear needy, that she must look strong and secure. Yet beneath this mask, the shadow speaks with a different voice. It whispers doubts, recalls old wounds, and stirs the fear of being unseen. The more she hides these feelings, the louder they grow in the quiet of her own heart. This is where the cost of the mask begins to show. The persona may smile, may speak lightly, may even pretend to be unaffected, but the body betrays the truth. A tightening in the chest, restless thoughts in the night, or the unspoken pressure she places on the next moment of closeness. When the inner world and the outer mask no longer align, tension grows and intimacy becomes less about love and more about performance. Jung wrote that the persona is necessary. It allows us to function in society, to relate to present and acceptable face. But when the persona hardens, when it replaces rather than protects the inner self, it becomes a prison. The woman who hides her vulnerability beneath a mask of indifference may look composed, but she is cut off from her own depths. And the man who hides his retreat behind silence may look in control, but he too becomes trapped in the cycle of his shadow. This battle between shadow and persona shapes the patterns that repeat in relationships. One partner withdraws, the other presses forward. One seeks space, the other seeks reassurance. Each acts out a role, but neither role speaks the full truth. The mask hides fear while the shadow carries it. Together they create distance where closeness was longed for. The stakes in this struggle are high. When the mask dominates, true intimacy cannot survive. A woman may convince herself that as long as she keeps the peace, he will stay. She may avoid asking for what she truly needs. She may trade authenticity for security. Yet in doing so, she drifts further from her own center. The relationship may continue, but it becomes hollow, a performance rather than a union. And when the shadow dominates, the cycle of fear becomes self-fulfilling. The fear of abandonment provokes behaviors that push the other away. The fear of rejection leads to constant testing, constant questioning, constant grasping for proof. What began as a quiet silence after passion now becomes the stage for endless inner battles. The person longs to be chosen, yet cannot feel chosen, no matter what is offered. This is the paradox of the third stage. The very strategies we use to protect ourselves, hiding behind a mask, clinging to a role, demanding words that soothe, become the very forces that deepen the fracture. The mask keeps us from being truly seen. The shadow keeps us from seeing clearly. Here we must pause and recognize that both partners carry this tension. For men, the shadow often appears as the fear of losing autonomy, of being consumed by expectation. For women, the shadow often appears as the fear of not being enough, of being replaced or forgotten. Though the forms differ, the root is the same. The ego defends itself through withdrawal or through demand, while the deeper self longs for connection. In these moments, we can see how easily intimacy collapses into a battle of defenses. His silence becomes her insecurity. Her questioning becomes his suffocation. Round and round it turns, each reaction strengthening the very thing both fear most. Neither the mask nor the shadow can resolve this conflict, for they are caught in the same circle of projection and defense. To step outside this cycle requires awareness, the willingness to name what is happening within. It requires looking into the mirror of the moment and admitting the silence is awakening my shadow. The mask is no longer enough to protect me. Such honesty is rare because it asks us to expose what we most want to hide. And yet without it, the relationship will continue to circle endlessly around the same wound. Jung reminded us that the shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of the self that has not yet been integrated. When a woman feels the sudden fear that she is not enough, that fear is not proof of her unworthiness. It is an old voice, a fragment of the psyche, calling to be recognized. If she ignores it, the shadow will control her from behind the mask. If she confronts it, the shadow becomes a teacher. This is the task in the third stage, to recognize the cost of the persona and the power of the shadow. To see how much energy is wasted in pretending, performing, and defending. To understand that the fracture after intimacy is not only between two people, but also within the self. When we begin to see this, the silence no longer appears only as a threat. It reveals itself as a mirror, showing us the tension between the face we present and the truth we hide. It asks, will you continue to live divided, one part smiling while another part aches, or will you face what rises in the dark and begin to reconcile with yourself? This recognition is painful because it strips away the illusions that comfort us. But it is also liberating. For once, the mask is seen for what it is, and the shadow is acknowledged. The soul can begin its deeper work. The fracture becomes not an ending, but a summons to integration. When the mask has cracked and the shadow has been revealed, a new possibility begins to show itself. It often appears first as a quiet realization. The silence that felt like rejection may not be rejection at all. What once seemed like an empty wall begins to look more like a doorway. In Jung's language, this is the moment of individuation, the shift from projecting fear outward to turning inward and asking, what does this reveal about me? Instead of chasing reassurance, she begins to notice her own breath. Instead of demanding answers, she rests in her own presence. This turning toward the self is the seed of awakening. Biologically, men often retreat after passion because their energy needs to return to balance. Psychologically, the masculine principle within all of us behaves in the same way. It extends outward, then withdraws to regain strength. This rhythm is not betrayal, it is law. When understood, it can free us from the story that every pause is abandonment. The awakening comes when a woman sees that she does not need to rush into that space with words, questions, or frantic gestures. Instead, she can hold the silence like a vessel. She can become the still water in which the other's reflection eventually returns. Her worth is not confirmed by his words in that moment. Her worth rests in her own being. Jung observed that the shadow loses its grip once it is made conscious. The fear that once screamed, "I am not enough," is recognized for what it is, an echo from the past, not the truth of the present. In that recognition, the silence transforms. It is no longer a void to be feared, but a sacred pause. A gate that leads not to separation, but to deeper connection. This gate requires trust. Trust not in what the other may or may not do, but trust in the self. To remain calm when the ego wants to panic. To breathe when the heart wants to grasp. To embody stillness when the shadow wants to cry out. This is the alchemy of awakening the transformation of fear into presence of doubt, into inner radiance. Imagine the difference. In one path, the silence is met with urgency. Questions spill out, eyes search for confirmation, and the bond tightens into pressure. The other retreats further, feeling suffocated, feeling watched. The door closes. In the other path, the silence is met with calm. She rests in her own center, not demanding, not collapsing, simply being. That stillness is felt, and it draws him back. The door opens. This is why silence, when held with serenity, becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. What was once unbearable emptiness becomes the very threshold through which true devotion can enter. The awakening is not about controlling the other. It is about choosing how to meet the moment. In Jungian terms, the woman in this stage is integrating her shadow. She no longer denies her fear, nor does she let it rule her. Instead, she acknowledges it and then chooses to act from her deeper self. This is individuation in practice, the movement from being ruled by unconscious wounds to consciously embodying the wholeness already present within. The awakening also reveals the difference between love as transaction and love as presence. A transaction says, "I gave you closeness, now give me words." Presence says, "I remain whole whether you speak or not." This shift is profound. It transforms intimacy from a bargain into a sacred meeting. When a woman enters this space, her energy changes. No longer frantic, no longer pleading. She becomes guome, magnetic rooted. She is no longer waiting to be chosen. She is choosing herself. And in that choice, paradoxically, she becomes unforgettable. For the human soul always remembers where it found peace. This stage also clarifies the contrast between demands and standards. Demands grasp outward, trying to force a response. Standards rise inward, setting the tone for how one will be present. When she holds her center with quiet strength, she is not demanding reassurance. She is embodying her standard. I am whole. I am steady. I will not collapse into fear. The awakening is not a one-time event. It is practiced each time silence comes. Each time the shadow stirs and the mask tempts her to pretend she must choose again. But with every repetition, the self grows stronger. the silence becomes less threatening. The shadow becomes less frightening. The mask becomes less necessary. And slowly, what began as the most painful moment, his turning away, her feeling abandoned, becomes the very ground where a deeper bond can form. The moment of fracture turns into the moment of awakening. What once carried only fear now carries possibility. This is the truth few are told. Silence is not the end of intimacy. It is part of its rhythm, part of its mystery, part of its depth. When a woman learns to hold that silence with serenity, she moves from being a seeker of reassurance to a bearer of peace. She becomes the threshold, the sanctuary, the place where the other longs to return. The awakening is this shift from seeing silence as rejection to seeing it as the sacred gate, a gate that opens not through words, but through presence, not through clinging, but through calm, not through fear, but through trust. It is the moment when the soul learns that love is not confirmed by constant affirmation, but by the strength to remain whole in the pauses between. Every awakening requires a choice. It is not enough to see the pattern, not enough to recognize the shadow, not enough to understand the silence. Awareness opens the door, but action determines whether the soul will cross the threshold. In this stage, the woman must decide whether she will keep circling the old cycle of fear, or whether she will embody a new standard. It is the moment when she moves from theory into practice. She learns that power is not found in trying to hold on. It is discovered in her capacity to remain steady, without demanding, to radiate presence, without collapsing into need. Jung often reminded us that individuation is not abstract. It is lived through choices, through boundaries, through the small but decisive acts by which we claim our truth. To hold her center when silence comes is one such act. It may appear simple on the surface: one breath, one pause, one refusal to grasp, but it carries immense power. Think of the contrast. The path of fear rushes into the silence with urgent words. Tell me what you feel. Do not leave me in this emptiness. The path of awakening holds back, breathes deeply and silently, says, I am here. I am whole. I will not collapse into fear. One path tightens the bond into a trap. The other path opens space for a deeper return. This choice becomes a boundary, though not a boundary against love. It is a boundary against fear. It is the decision not to allow the shadow to dictate her response. Instead of pressing outward, she turns inward, grounding herself in the certainty of her own worth. By doing so, she creates an invisible sanctuary. Boundaries of this kind are quiet but unmistakable. They do not require harsh words or rigid ultimatums. They are communicated through presence, through the vibration of self-respect. In silence, the other feels it. Without knowing why, he begins to sense that he is not being chased, not being pressured. He feels invited rather than cornered. And it is this freedom that calls him back willingly and without resistance. Here, the paradox of love reveals itself. What cannot be forced can only be received. What cannot be demanded becomes most powerful when it is freely given. When she embodies her boundary, she no longer grasps at proof. She allows the relationship to breathe, and in that breathing space, devotion has the chance to grow. This transformation also reveals the distinction between control and influence. Control tries to shape another's behavior through demand or pressure. Influence radiates from within, drawing the other through presence. Jung might say that true influence comes when the ego surrenders its grasp and the self shines through. The woman who stands in her calm, magnetic essence becomes a presence that lingers. She influences not by demand, but by being unforgettable. Notice how this shifts the balance. Before the silence, after intimacy, felt like an abyss. It triggered the shadow's fear, which drove desperate behaviors that deepened the fracture. Now the same silence becomes a sacred pause. It is no longer a place where she loses herself. It is a place where she finds herself. This is the essence of transformation, turning what was once a wound into a source of power. The boundary also extends beyond intimacy. Once a woman learns to hold her center in this most vulnerable moment, she carries the same strength into other areas of life. She no longer explains herself endlessly to those who doubt her. She no longer accepts crumbs when she longs for devotion. She no longer sacrifices her standards to keep the peace. The act of holding her ground in silence becomes the foundation for holding her ground everywhere. This is the mark of individuation. The outer relationship mirrors the inner one. By learning to stay steady in the face of another's withdrawal, she heals the deeper pattern of abandoning herself. Each time she chooses presence over panic, each time she sets a quiet boundary, instead of collapsing into fear, she strengthens her bond with her own soul. Transformation is not dramatic. It rarely comes with fanfare or sweeping gestures. More often, it is quiet, subtle, almost invisible. But its effects are unmistakable. The woman who once chased now waits in calm. The woman who once doubted now rests in her own worth. The woman who once begged for reassurance now radiates a peace that needs no proof. And here lies the paradox. Jung understood so well, when a woman stops trying to hold on, she becomes the one who cannot be forgotten. When she no longer demands presence, she becomes the place where presence returns again and again. What once was seen as weakness, her silence, her stillness, becomes the very source of her power. This is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is the conscious choice to meet the moment with clarity rather than fear. It is the decision to embody standards instead of demands. It is the quiet but unshakable boundary: I will not abandon myself no matter what you do. The consequences of this choice are profound. Some relationships will deepen, for the man who feels freedom will often draw closer with sincerity. Others may fade, revealing bonds that were only ever sustained by need or habit. Either way, the woman stands rooted in her own essence. She has chosen her own wholeness above the illusion of control. And that choice is the foundation of love that endures. This is the work of transformation. Not to control the other, not to erase the silence, but to decide how to meet it. To meet it with calm, with trust, with presence. To let the shadow be seen, but not obeyed. To let the mask fall away, and the true self rise in its place. Every cycle of intimacy will bring the silence again. But now, the silence is no longer feared. It has become a sacred gate, a space where love is not demanded, but allowed, not grasped, but invited, not performed, but lived. This is the moment where individuation blossoms into relationship, where self-respect becomes the ground of union. When the journey has been walked, when the silence is no longer feared, something remarkable becomes clear. What once seemed like rejection was never rejection at all. It was a mirror, a teacher, and finally a doorway. The silence that once tore open old wounds now becomes the place where healing begins. No longer an abyss, it is a threshold. No longer a test, it is an initiation. In meeting it calmly, you discover that love is not proven in words or in constant reassurance. Love is revealed in presence, and presence arises only when you no longer abandon yourself. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This truth echoes here. For the woman who no longer fills silence with fear, who no longer hides behind a mask or bends beneath demands, has entered her truest self. She has chosen to live not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as one who has already chosen herself. In this way, intimacy is transformed. It is no longer an exchange of proof or a bargain of needs. It becomes a sanctuary, a shared field where two souls may meet without fear. The body can give pleasure, but only conscious presence touches the soul. The one who carries peace within becomes unforgettable, not because of what she gives, but because of what she awakens. Think of it this way. Demands come from emptiness, but standards arise from fullness. Demands grasp outward, while standards root inward. When you live by demands, you exhaust yourself and unsettle the bond. When you live by standards, you stand calm, radiant, and magnetic. This is the quiet power no one can overlook. The silence after passion is not the end of love. It is its testing ground. It is here that you learn whether you will hand yourself over to fear or remain faithful to your own worth. And it is here that the deepest devotion is born, not out of pressure, but out of freedom. For when someone feels that you are not clutching, not pressing, not demanding, but holding a space of calm, welcome, they return of their own free will. They return not out of guilt or habit, but because your presence feels like home. This is the mystery Jung pointed toward when he spoke of individuation, to walk through the shadow, to let the mask fall, to meet silence with trust. These are not small things. They are the path to wholeness. And wholeness is what makes a soul magnetic, a presence that lingers long after the words have faded. What began as a fracture ends as integration. The shadow is no longer an enemy. The silence is no longer a wall. They have become teachers showing the way back to yourself. In that return, the relationship may deepen or it may dissolve. But either way, you are no longer lost in fear. You have discovered the sacred center that no silence can take away. This is the life lesson to carry forward. True power does not come from holding on to another. It comes from standing firmly in your own essence. It comes from remembering that love is not something to be seized, but something to be allowed. The woman who embodies this truth becomes irreplaceable, not because she clings, but because she radiates peace. And so we close where we began, but with new eyes. Silence is not the absence of love. It is the space in which love is tested, refined, and reborn. To meet it with fear is to repeat the old story. To meet it with trust is to write a new one. Carry this reflection gently. Let it shape how you move, not only in intimacy, but in every part of life where silence arises. For silence will come in relationships, in waiting in the unknown. And each time you will face the same choice, collapse into fear or rest in presence. Choose presence. Choose stillness. Choose to be the one who does not abandon herself, for that is the presence no one forgets. Before we part, I invite you to take a moment and reflect. Which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you? Share it in the comments if you feel moved, because your reflection may be the very mirror another soul needs. And remember this as you carry it into your life. Love that endures is not born of constant words or restless demands. It is born in the quiet strength of a soul that knows its own worth.